Thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm Kian Lee from Community Science. I have the privilege here today with being here today with two amazing people, and I will let them say hello. I will start with Glenn and then to Wilan because she'll cover the next slide after this.
Beautiful. Hello, Kian. It's such a pleasure to be here with you and Wilan. My name is Glenn Harris. I'm president of Race Forward. I'm also the publisher of Color Lines, and just really excited about having the time today to talk about evaluation and equity. And with that, I'll just hand it over to Wilan.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. And my name is Huilan Kwan. I echo Glenn and Kian's welcome of you. Today's webinar is actually a follow-up of the Kellogg Foundation's release of a new publication, a three-part series of practice guides. And the title is right here, Doing Evaluation in Service of Racial Equity. These guides aim to provide evaluation professionals like yourself with concrete how-to knowledge on incorporating racial equity as a core value in designing and implementing evaluation activities. It's much easier said than done, of course. A series of practice guides complement and also supplement the other resources the Kellogg Foundation created, such as Logic Model Development Guide, Step-by-Step Guide to Evaluation, How to Become Savvy Evaluation Consumers. So about the guides, why did the Kellogg Foundation commission these guides? It's partially and first and foremost because of the Kellogg Foundation's long-standing commitment to racial equity, so much so that in 2015, our CEO and the president, LeJeune Montgomery Tabron, officially named racial equity, including racial healing, leadership development, and community engagement as our DNA. That means racial equity is embedded in everything that we do, including evaluation. Back in 1999, if you were born yet at that time, the Kellogg Foundation seed funded the American Evaluation Association's Building Diversity Initiative, explicitly focusing on diversifying the evaluator pipeline and promoting culturally competent evaluation practices. Decades later, along with many of you, we are actually taking it beyond diversity and cultural competency, and we are embarking on the journey of equitable evaluation. And so in summary, doing evaluation to advance racial equity agenda in service of racial equity is part of who we are. It's also our core value. It's part of our history. It's also part of our mission at the Kellogg Foundation. As an evaluation community, many of you know and already experienced, we have gained deeper understanding, at least conceptually, of racial equity principles, definitions, symptoms of racism in systems. We have also made tremendous progress to advance evaluation as a discipline and as a practice to such a level that where many organizations have actually institutionalized evaluation as their core business. That is very impressive accomplishment. However, doing evaluation in service of racial equity seems to be still in its infancy. I'm talking about doing evaluation, not talking about evaluation. So the global outcry for racial justice in the past few years have grown our collective desire and hunger for something concrete and something practical that links evaluation to racial equity. That's where this three-part series of practice guides come in. I hope these guides will help enhance your role in our collective journey of challenging the status quo and dismantling systemic racism, no matter where we are and each one of us are on this journey. And I thank you again for participating in today's webinar. And I also challenge you to explore these guides and begin using them in your own racial equity work with your colleagues, grantees, partners, stakeholders, clients, and the communities that you live as well as serve. As a funder, the privilege that we have is the ability to commission critical bodies of work like this. I'm very grateful for Dr. Kian Lee from Community Science to author these guides. We just commissioned it, and she actually did all the work of writing it. So today you are in for a treat to delve deeper into one of the three guides, which is subtitle is Diagnose Biases and the Systems, with this brilliant and distinguished leading evaluator, Dr. Kian Lee. Now I'm turning it back to you, Kian.
Thanks, Wei-Lan. I appreciate this. I was going to say this later, but I'm going to say it now. This could not have been done without my colleagues here at Community Science and in the field of evaluation as well as social justice. You know, I think we continue to try and get better and do better because of the feedback we get, because of the relationships we are in. So I want to thank the thought leaders in the practice of evaluation who have paved the way for the conversations that we are having today. And there are many, from everyone who has pushed for democratic evaluation to culturally responsive evaluation to equitable evaluation. I also want to give a shout out to the people who reviewed drafts of these practice guides. You know who you are. And I want to thank you so much for sharing your time and your wisdom so generously. So let me start by just with a slight takeaways for today. We're going to dive a little bit into what a systems lens is, how to apply to theories of change and logic models, and where can biases potentially show up in the process. So as my team here at Community Science has taught us, I really should start with a personal story so that you know who I am. And so I first came to understand systems and systems lens through the experience of my family. I had cousins who attended high school in one part of the county and friends and colleagues who had children who attended school in another part of the county. There was no question that my cousins who would go to community college. A four-year college or university was not an option for most of them. And that was because they didn't have enough support to help them navigate college applications and get financial aid, all the way to the parents who never questioned or challenged what the school was doing and not doing for them. This was in contrast to my friends and colleagues who never doubted for a second that their children would be graduating high school and going straight to a four-year college or university of their choice. They talked about speaking to the teachers about how their kids are doing and making sure that kids got the best SAT scores through all kinds of help to be able to get into the college and university of their choice. The difference between my cousins and these other kids was their parents' socioeconomic status and where they lived. In an area where the houses were cheaper and an area where the houses were $1 million or more. I quickly learned that the resources and opportunities offered by schools in this country depended on property taxes, a major revenue source for public schools. Naturally, the schools in the area where property values are $1 million or over will have more revenue and therefore can afford higher quality support for the kids there. What made it more, but what made this also more complex is another layer here is that the Asian student population in our county here in Maryland are high achieving. They're not the ones experiencing education disparities. They have the highest performance ratings. But this is not true for my family, who is from Central Asia and came as political asylees and refugees. So what we tend to do is lump all Asians in one category, and the high performance of some groups of Asian children mask the low performance of other groups of Asian children, making it look as if this population lives up to its model minority stereotype. Consequently, nobody pays much attention to the Asian kids who need more support. And of course, we know that education affects employment, which affects income, which affects the house we can afford, which affects access to health care. I quickly learned that the disparities we face are not always what they appear to be. And it behooved me to go look beyond the behaviors of the young people in my family to fully appreciate what they were able to achieve despite the inequities they face every day, and what they could have achieved if they had equitable access to the best opportunities and resources. And that's how I arrived to where I am today in terms of the systems lens that I see. And as one person once told me, when you see things this way, there is no going back. You see everything this way. So where do we start? Because as evaluators, there's so much to do and it can be overwhelming, and doing evaluation in service of racial equity won't be easy or quick. It is a practice. It is a practice we have to hone over time, right? And it's not something we can do alone. It takes other people who are part of the ecosystem of social change to make sure that evaluations in service of racial equity are being practiced. So we start with the theory of change and logic model. And why? Because this is often where we start first in an evaluation. The functions of a theory of change and logic model are not new to many of you on this call, I'm sure, right? So I'm not going to go over them. I want to bring your attention to the last point, which is transform systems. If we are intentional about facilitating the development of a theory of change that will help advance racial equity, then the theory of change and logic model we end up with can help to transform systems, because the focus will be on systemic change. And I'm going to review an example of this later. The process of developing the theory of change and logic model has a lot of room for biases. And if we're not thoughtful and intentional about these biases in the beginning, it can have a ripple effect on everything that we do after that. So let's just think about a minute for where those biases can show up. Do we assume that people from other cultures see things the same way we do? Let's go back to the story I shared earlier. In this country, parents are expected to get involved in their children's education. They attend PTA meetings and more. They challenge teachers. Well, not everyone in the world sees it this way. In some countries, parents trust their children's teachers and view the teachers as authoritative figures and experts in their children's education. So we believe that parents, no matter their cultural background or socioeconomic background, right, will naturally get involved with their children's schools and know how to do that. How do we perceive parents who don't? How do we interpret findings about high or low parent engagement? What do we think it will take to get parents more involved? Let's take another one. Do we believe that individuals, organizations, or systems are at the root of the problem we're trying to deal with? Right? What narratives do we buy into about the people, the communities, and the place? For example, do we believe that everyone can eat healthy if they choose to? And so the high obesity rates in the neighborhood is the fault of the people? Or do we believe it's bigger than the individuals that live there? Is it because there are no stores for miles that sell fresh produce and it takes 2 buses to get to the store if you don't have a car, right? What type of narrative do we believe about the people from that place? How do we interpret data about high or low rates of obesity in a place? What do we think it will take to actually reduce that rate? And last but not least, which research methodology do we identify with? Do we think that randomized controlled trials are the gold standard? Or do we dismiss quantitative measures altogether and believe that only qualitative data provides the truth? Choosing one or the other because of our own biases about which one's the better methodology can lead to the wrong design for the change strategy, which can lead to false results and even harmful narratives. Right? And if these biases are not addressed in the theory of change and logic model, everything that flows from it, the measurement framework, the capacity building plan, the learning strategy improvement agenda, they will all be flawed. They will all carry biases. So I'm going to stop here actually and invite Glenn to comment, right? Glenn, you've worked with evaluators, you evaluate your work, you know what theories of change and logic models are. What other biases do you think can show up? And what would a social justice leader like yourself need from evaluators and evaluation at this stage of the work when we're playing with the theory of change and logic model?
That's it. Well, and Kian, I mean, just to start there, everything, that's what we need from our evaluators is everything. You know, let me just back up. Again, my name's Glenn Harris. I'm president of Race Forward. And just want to share a little bit that our vision at Race Forward is a just multiracial democratic society in which everyone can thrive. And I say that because we also are today, we're acknowledging the 1-year anniversary of the attack on the Capitol. And our democracy has not been in a moment that's this unstable in any of our lifetime. And deeply believe that the only way that we make it stable is that we get real about how we bring racial justice and to how we talk about and manifest democratic practice. And that requires us to be real about how we're evaluating our impact and our progress. It requires real rigor. And so I really wanted to start out by saying, everyone joining, thank you. Because at the end of the day, we're talking about how do different outcomes manifest in the daily lives of Black and Brown people that work to collectively advance our communities and our country. Just that simple. That's a bold task. And so as we think about it, getting it right matters. And to Kian's point, there's all sorts of biases that pop up in this process. And Kian, you named many of them beautifully. The ones that I would caution us are some of the meta biases, like our confirmation bias. That it's really easy, even if we're bringing a broad cultural lens, to make assumptions about what the outcome will be or should be. And that frequently gets in the way of us asking different questions. And, I'll give an example. We work with about 400 government jurisdictions across the country through a network called the Government Alliance on Race and Equity. And early on, when we were doing evaluation within government, we actually were scared to ask the question about whether how people were responding to training and education around race and equity. Because we had all heard repeatedly, we all hear it, it's so divisive, right? I mean, this is what the entire CRT conversation, critical race theory conversation in the country is right now. But one of the things that in asking it, we actually ended up determining was that, in fact, the more conversations that any individual department had about race, the higher they rated their opinion about their department, about their trust in fellow employees. And so those biases sometimes are confirmation bias, what we think the outcome will be, get in our way of actually asking questions for us to get to a deeper understanding of what's actually occurring. And so I wanted to flag that because I think it happens a lot for us. Don't be afraid to ask questions in which you think the outcome might be negative. We learn from those. The other bias is scale. It's the impact bias. This idea that if something is having a profound impact on people, big, that somehow the response to it needs to be the same. And I'll give you another example, which was this around immigration and the reality that misdemeanor crimes had a disproportionate impact on immigrants. So if you get charged with certain kinds of misdemeanors, it results in a year-long suspended sentence. You're on probation for a year. But it turns out that a year-long sentence, whether it's suspended or otherwise, triggers an automatic deportation proceedings. And so there's a lot of research done into looking at, what is the nature of the law, all of it, everything you can imagine, and thinking about the impact of that. But it turned out that it was a very simple solution, that it was simply moving it from 364 days to 363 days, right? It was just cutting a day off of what it meant to have a suspended sentence. So I named those two examples because I think sometimes both when we enter in with our confirmation, A, checking our bias, our cultural biases within that context, but B, just checking what our assumptions are is essential. And the second, that sometimes the answers we're looking for are much smaller than we actually perceive, given the impact that it's actually having on individuals. So just wanting to lift up those two examples. The last thing I would just name around this is that, you know, Kian led with it, that this work is a practice. We're talking about systemic change. Coming to understand even what systemic means can take years in a meaningful way, right, Kian? And so I think in that way, really recognizing we're on a journey, that we're actually thinking about this as a way in which we are collectively learning and treat it as a deliberate practice. Each step of the way, taking away not only what information might benefit our communities, but what information might tell us, inform us in a more thoughtful way for the next time we head into evaluation.
Thanks, Glenn. Gosh, confirmation bias and bias about scale, right? Two things. And what I got out of what you said is the importance of really asking a lot of questions so that we can check if those biases exist, right?
That's right. That's
and
right.
I think I was speaking to a colleague the other day, Alicia, who's going to be at the webinar next week about community engagement, said this. We are so trained because we have higher degrees, right? We are so trained to think that we should have the answers, not the questions. So we don't
It's
have
so true.
questions, right? We're supposed to
It's
come
so
with
true.
answers. And yet it's the questions that we have to ask. I will always remember my professor from school who said to me, the day you get your PhD is the day you realize you know very little.
Right.
And just we're on a journey of learning. And I think that's
the more you know, the more you know you don't know.
That's
right.
Right. That's right.
Yes,
So honing that practice and that skill of asking questions so that the questions we ask become second nature in our practice. And I hope that's what we can get today. And so this next slide actually hopefully will start to dig us into it. And then I'll have Glenn comment again at the end.
Beautiful.
I'm going to walk us now through this idea of a systems and systems lens, right? So I shared the personal story about how I saw systems and how systems affected my family. This is the official definition. A system has a purpose. It has many parts. It has structure and feedback loops that maintain the system. And it has a purpose whether you like the purpose or not. So I'll start here with right here, here's the system. And the system is normally something we don't see. So it's a little bit underneath the soil, right? It's part of the roots. And then what happens is that informing the systems and the narratives, are people's narratives, are mental models, are people's frames of thinking that are really baked into the systems and how they're operated and managed. And sometimes we can't even pinpoint that individual. It is that sometimes amorphous to us, but it's there, and it's what everyday decisions are made about systems, right? Which part of systems are policies. So, I think, Glenn, you just named a few about how policies, how ways of thinking impact how things are happening and what decisions are made. These systems, then, what they do is generate certain patterns and trends, right? For example, children of color not having quality education affects graduation rates, affects employment when they become adults, affects income, and so on and so on. Those are the patterns and trends that we begin to see. And then these patterns that we see over and over again contribute to the systems. This is what we can see in our data. This is the disparities we see in our data when we compare groups. Sometimes you can walk around a place and even see these symptoms. So I want to start here because this is really what we see as a system and the systems lens. So let's just try this, for example. I'm going to walk through a very basic theory of change that I think many of you would have seen this over and over again. We want to reduce education disparities and improve education outcomes. That's the impact we want to make. Well, debating about how we do it, decisions in the room, discussions, we landed on two things. Oh, actually, sorry, one big thing. If we increase math and reading proficiency by 3rd grade, hopefully we can reduce education disparities and improve outcomes, because it starts when the children are young, right? So we're trying to get it back to as close to the roots as possible. Well, how do we do this? Discussion, after lots of discussions, the people in the room say, let's improve the learning climate at home, and let's improve adherence to curriculum and instruction standards so that we can get increased proficiency for the children. So that means really, what do we need to do? Let's get parents more involved so that they can create that learning climate at home. Let's make sure that teachers are trained and they have professional development so that they can implement that curriculum and those standards. And as funders, we'll provide money, we'll have facilitate school community partnerships, we'll provide technical assistance and support. Pretty straightforward, not uncommon. We've seen this. It makes sense, right? At a superficial level, it makes sense. Now, let's take a look at when we dig into it using a systems lens. Same theory of change. I'm going to start with the symptoms from the trees down to the roots. Which children are we talking about? Why these children? Did we disaggregate the data sufficiently to know which populations and subpopulations are most affected? Remember my story about the Asian community and lumping everybody into one, right? Here's another symptom. Which teachers are performing at a higher level and which aren't? Why did we disaggregate the data sufficiently? Because there's data. We can see the data. It's the symptom. Here's the pattern. What other outcomes are affected by third grade reading and math proficiency? Why? So what is this connected to? What's the pattern? Do parents have everything they need to provide a learning climate at home? What else affects this? Why? Let's take a look at the symptoms. Well, are there standards to begin with? Why aren't teachers adhering to them if they're standards? Are we focused on the teachers' behaviors, individual behaviors, or is there something else going on in the system? Are we looking at a systemic change? And I will say that in one place, when we asked this question, the state actually had no standards. There were no standards. So what are we talking about in terms of teachers' performance? So what do we miss here? And the state gave out emergency licenses. So teachers got emergency licenses to teach, even though they didn't have all the qualifications because there was a shortage of teachers. Are all teachers taking advantage of these opportunities or just some of them? It's a systemic issue. Why or why not? And then let's take a look at the roots. What narrative exists about the parents and teachers implicitly referenced and suggested here? Like why do we think teachers? Why do we think parents? What's going on in our heads about teachers and parents and why we think they have control to be able to effect that change? Are parents the main reason for the lack of a learning climate at home? Who makes what decisions about support for parents? What's the frame of thinking for decision makers? Why these decisions? So we really need to start digging into these questions. And if you notice, I bolded the why in everything. It's as simple as that. And it's like that annoying kid, why? And it's like as adults, we got to do the same. Why? We have to interrogate that. And so if you do that, chances are you'll end up with a very different theory of change, right? And a different logic model that transforms systems. So here's one, and it's just illustrative of what a different theory of change look like if you start to ask those questions. It's not the best, it's not the right one. It's just an illustrative of how it look different. And now I'm going to start from the roots up to the leaves, right? What were mental models? So part of the now theory of change is let's change narratives about Black and Latino parents because it was the Black and Latino students that we're talking about, not just all students. Let's name it. Glenn always says this, let's name it, right? Let's name it. What are those narratives about these parents? What's the systems that we're trying to change? So then if we're really talking about systems, we're changing relationships and policies that manage organizations across sectors, across groups, and institutionalizing this change so that no matter what happens, that capacity is there to mobilize and to work together across sectors and across systems. Patterns and trends. Let's make sure that we're affecting other outcomes. So here's the priorities of families get addressed. So they have other priorities that are connected to their ability to be able to support their children's learning. What are those priorities? Let's connect them so that we're addressing them in the new theory of change and the initiative. And then lastly, hopefully, we're seeing the closing of the gap in a sustained way. right? And I was just talking to my colleague this morning, David, about this too, and how do we sustain this? What are we sustaining here? What do we leave behind? So hopefully we see the symptoms change, right? There's a reduction in the disparities, closing of the gap, but hopefully this all gets sustained too. Because then what happens is that this community of Black and Latino parents can then have the relationships, access to decision makers to then be able to affect other things now that impact the quality of lives. So we begin to ask those questions that were in the previous slide, and we begin to think differently and have a different theory of change. You now have a theory of change that is more transformative, as my colleague here, Antoine, would say, it's more transformative. Right? So this is a very quick, simple way of just how we would apply the systems lens. I mean, there's a lot more we can go into and go deeper, but we only have an hour. So I just wanted to run through this quickly and then summarize this in the next slide, which says like, okay, here's what we do, right? We want to analyze data for populations underserved by the current systems and disaggregate the data as much as possible. We know that not all that data is available, and disaggregation of data is very challenging. So that means that you also might need to go collect new data. We want to examine disparities between groups at the intersection of multiple identities. It's not just disaggregating it by race and ethnicity, it's disaggregating it by race, ethnicity, and gender. Race, ethnicity, and gender, and income. Race, ethnicity, gender, income, and zip code. I mean, you just have to keep going deeper and deeper and deeper, right? And going back to the point where practicing this is not just evaluators' job alone, because it'd be great if funders can take a look at this and think about, hey, if the data doesn't exist in the place, what can philanthropy do to shore up the data infrastructure and collect the data that's much needed, right? And sustain those capacities, because that's a big problem too. We don't have the data. We want to identify what process and outcome data need to be collected. It's not just looking at the reduction in disparities, because getting to racial inequity lies in processes and outcomes, right? So we want to look at the way business is done, the way relationships are developed and leveraged, the way people are treated, the way policies are implemented, right? These are process outcomes and process data we need to be able to get to. Most of it is also qualitative, right? Which gets us a little bit into the debate of qualitative, quantitative data that I'm not going to get into here, but that's another big barrier we have in our field. Determine enabling and impeding factors and circumstances, because systems don't operate in a vacuum and are not independent of one another. So Donella Meadows, that I've cited here, wrote a great book about systems, and she describes systems in terms of pipes. A leak in one part of the pipe system can cause a major drainage in another part of the system. And this is illustrative of how we have to be mindful of unintended outcomes and consequences. Capacity building is a huge thing that we overlook, especially for evaluators. And I challenge evaluators, what's our role in determining capacities? Often we evaluate, but we have a role in building capacity, whether it's the capacity to assess data and use evaluation, or any other capacity. So oftentimes we find that we have the best theory, the best logic model, but implementation is flawed because we never paid attention to what the competencies were in the first place that were needed and were in place and needed to be strengthened. And lastly, I think everyone gets on the same page with the same agenda. The theory of change helps to do that. And it helps us to do that in a way that we can see our place in that theory of change and the logic model, and what we each have to do based on our unique position of where we are and the power that we have or don't have to be able to influence change. So these are just 7 kind of like quick synthesis of what we can do. And with that, I'm going to pause again and turn it over to Glenn and ask him what he thinks and what else he thinks evaluators can do to hone the use of a systems lens. And I'm going to keep coming back to this question, Glenn. What else do you think you need from evaluators?
It's such a great question. And Ken, I just have to pause and just say how great this work is. And thank you for putting it all together. And the responses, I've been paying attention to the chat. The responses in the chat have been inspiring in many ways. So what else do we need? There is so much we need. And you touched on, elements of it, Ken. you know, at its core, our definition of systemic is, that systemic racism really is about how white folks have been able to use policy, institutions, and culture to drive a system of white supremacy. Those are the pillars. And at its core, really pushing the idea that the only way to change that is the way it was created, that we actually have to have the power to change policies, institutions, and culture if we want to end up in a different place. And so, for us, one of the things that I think we see constantly is that the overwhelming emphasis, you named this, Kian, is on policy. It's on the tip of the iceberg. It's on the very final outcome. And I can tell you, we see it in the field. You could change policies all day long, literally every day, and we would still have many of the same outcomes we have. Mm-hmm. Hate to say it, it's just true. It's not enough. Mm-hmm. Necessary, but not sufficient. And so our ability and our thinking about what is the function role of institutions in systems and what they play, essential. And we've got to get better at evaluating. Really, what are their impacts? What do they mean as entities? Some really core questions. And culture, which that one, we do a lot of work around narrative arts and culture. And, culture is, it's big. It requires us to back up for a second and think about making measurement of ideas that are not measurable, but are still trackable, still able for us to think about what their influence is. Maybe just naming that. How do we get better at measuring influence, not just impact? So I think, writ large, there's a lot of work we need to do in reimagining at its core the system of evaluation. And, I saw folks name it in here about, it's frequently an add-on. The fact that we're even begging the question of cost in evaluation tells us exactly what the problem is, because evaluation should be built into everything we're doing, should be part of the cost, not an additional cost. I think the other piece for us is, I saw several folks naming, the reality that, that systemic impacts are not just racial. And of course, they are not just racial. We use a race and lens, and you named it, whether we're thinking about race, gender, oppression as we understand it as a concept is systemic. But the point is that specificity matters. And I wanted to say that. One of the mistakes I think we see a lot is folks talking about measuring equity. And literally equity, at its roots means context. It's the context for justice. So that's like saying I'm measure. It's just a measurement, equity itself, right? So that's why the question is, are you measuring racial equity? Are you measuring gender equity? What are you measuring? And are you being clear about the impact? That is so essential. And I think it gets lost, can get watered down really quickly as we have these conversations about measuring the impact and the justice that we want to see in the world. So, those are some of the things that, I'm really holding. I think it's really critical. A mad love to Kellogg for supporting this work. I think at the level of philanthropy, there is a deep need to get real about what it's going to take to be able to make this kind of measurement and evaluation simply part of how at least the nonprofit sector does its job. I also think, likewise, that this should be a fundamental call for government. And you named it. It's the piece I'll wrap up on. Is that there should be no call for a product without a call for change in process. Mm-hmm. Those two things have to be bound. And even as we're pushing for ideas of policy change, we should be demanding process change towards how we make policy, including how we evaluate what the impact is. Yeah. Right? You do this all the time, right? We see it in the world. folks are pumping out tons of stuff without ever thinking about how they're going to measure it over time, what its real impact is, unless they come back to it accidentally or someone complains 2 or 3 years later. It should be built in. It just so fundamentally should.
Yeah, thanks, Glenn. I think you hit on so many important points, and what you just said just now about, like, it's demanding both the policy change, but also the change in process. It just made me think of, 2 stories. One very recently is just about, a community that we know of that actually leveraged they got a community center for youth built in their community, right? And they were able to get that. And everybody was so excited. That was a huge accomplishment. But if we step back and just think about what you just said, the process and outcome, right? That community center is just sort of like the physical, right, manifestation of what really happened. What happened should happen, that the resident leaders were able and had the capacity, or developed and strengthened their capacity, to go to the city government and say, we don't have facilities for our youth, right? And they don't have access to resources and opportunities. So you need to look at your budget, and how do you allocate money to create this community center? And that, when they then got the decision that a community center we built, that part of them going to the city government and asking for that and demanding that is the prize, right?
It is the prize.
But we never
I
pay
love
enough
that example.
attention. We don't pay enough attention to that.
We don't. And to your point, that community then is in a place to make those demands and get those needs met in any number of ways.
Exactly.
And yet we're not tracking, to your point, is the community's ability to bring new folks in expanding? Is the community's ability to get to a deeper understanding of budgeting actually occurring? All of those things that would actually be essential in turning that from a win to an ongoing success.
That's right.
And that's
Yep.
I love that example, Keen.
Sustainable success, right?
Sustainability.
Yep. I think I had another situation where someone said to me that they had a ballot initiative and it didn't pass, and she said, we failed, right? And I was like, you didn't fail, because if you had to think about all the relationships you had to develop and mobilize at the grassroots level to even get to that point, that's huge. Example. Right? That's huge. And because her fear was like, our funder just looked at us and saw that we didn't pass it, we failed. I'm like, that's not the story you want to tell. It's more than that. That's not the only thing. And kind of made her rethink. It's like, you're right. She's like, we can pick up the phone next time and call somebody when we need them to mobilize around something. Like, that's part of your success.
It's a huge part of the success, right?
And it goes back to the way we think. I think the culture around measurement, right? And so that person is looking for that outcome, right? That the ballot initiative passed, and not thinking about everything else. And just see how that plays out. They don't tell the story right. They don't tell the story right. They're not going to get the funding to support that work.
It's a beautiful example. And Kian, to your point, I think we see this a lot. We're in a midterm year, and we see this phenomenon a lot around elections. Right, where organizations who are focused on getting people elected, passing ballot measures, et cetera, suddenly see this massive flow of money. And then we'll see next year all that money drop off. Mm-hmm. And the reality is that it means the following year, folks will have to go through a very similar process to try to bring all the folks they brought in this year back in. And that's, to your point, like us having a very different imagination of what success looks like. I just love that, Kian. That in fact, that if the question is, how are we actually growing our numbers, not whether or not we're winning, any given instance, much better question. If we're really talking, and you and I didn't spend a lot of time talking about this, but if we're really talking about power, and I think that's, it's one of the pieces you named. And I think that's the frequently, the elephant in the room. Are we really naming power? People building, owning, using their power. And how do we actually measure that? How do we actually name that? How do we actually frame that as success?
Yeah. thanks for bringing that up, Glenn. That word, yes, I think it's really important that we bring that in here. So kind of related to that, right? I mean, I see power as the ability to influence change, right? And to do something about it. There's actually a question in the chat about whether or not you can provide an example of measuring influence, not just impact. Like what would be an example of how we measure influence or what that influence is?
I think that I love that question. And I wish I had a really great answer for you. But actually, I'm being honest, I just have more questions. This is what I will share. That one of the things I had mentioned earlier, the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, this network. And one of the things that we've been able to do is over time is, well, this last year we did a evaluation with, I don't know, 20,000 government employees, right? From different jurisdictions. But what I'm really clear is that we use much of that information as a way of helping jurisdictions as a diagnostic tool, understanding where they're at in people's understanding and learning about race and equity, and understanding where the organization is at in its understanding of race and equity and how that's showing up. But what I'm really clear is that you know, a classic evaluator would tell me, you can't clump all that data together. Like those are very different entities. Like you're talking about different states, you're talking about different people in different systems, but to the same question. And what I'm really clear is that those questions collectively add up to something that is telling us a story about influence, about the way in which ideas spread. And so I think in that way, you know, we use it to be able to talk about, you know, how change occurs. One of the things we know, for example, is that as a result of that kind of evaluation, that kind of assessment, that kind of surveying, what we've been really clear on is that when you ask an organization, just as one example, how they are doing on racial equity in year one, if you come back in years 2 and 3, their assessment goes down, right?
Yep.
And that is a measurement of influence. It is with what we were joking about, you were naming with your professor. The more you know, the more you know you don't know. The deeper you get, the better you understand that actually we've got a lot of work to do.
Yeah.
But it's easy if you're actually not thinking about that as a trajectory of understanding and just doing it as a simple measurement. It's telling the wrong story. It's actually saying that things are getting worse, as opposed to, no, that is actually the process of things getting better.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a lot that we need to think about in terms of influence that is both about thinking about aggregate information and what is it telling us about how we learn, grow, and apply, and that trajectory. And you've talked a lot about this, Kian, that if we're really talking about ideas of systemic change, like you can't measure that in 12 months. That's simple, right? It's a silly idea. So how are we actually really thinking about these issues as an arc in what we're learning, even as we're looking for specific outcomes and their impact?
That's great. I love that, because what you just said also made me think about earlier when we were talking about biases, right? Like what's our own biases about how people learn and knowledge development, right? So typically we expect the line in a graph to go straight up, right? But what you're gonna see here, it's gonna be up and it's gonna go down, you know, and hopefully it comes back up again, right? And how do we interpret that data depends on the way we thought about it in the first place. Yeah,
that's right.
I think that's a great example. I'm looking at some of the questions in here too. I think there's one about
someone named Dunning-Kruger. It's funny, Key and I were just talking about that the other day.
Yeah.
Just cognitive bias, right? It's just that idea that what we're naming, that, you know, the Dunning-Kruger study actually showed that the more you know something, the lower you're likely to rate yourself on it. And the less you know something, the higher you're likely to rate yourself on it. It's a great, to your point, because it is exactly the Dunning-Kruger effect.
Yeah. There's a question here about what do you see as the relationship between formal evaluation and community indicators and performance measures? That's a great question. And it actually reminds me, Glenn, of when we first started working together with the city governments, and we were creating that theory of change, and there was so much confusion about this. So I'll take a stab at it, and please, Glenn, feel free to jump in.
Go ahead.
I see community indicators as like that population level change that we're using to gauge whether there's change happening at a higher level, right, at the population level. I see performance measures as something that like you're doing, and whether you're performing, right? You say you're going to do X, are you actually doing X in a high performing way to be able to help you impact that population level change? And the evaluation then looks at all of that, right, and connects it all. And that's kind of how I look at it. I also believe that in theories of change and logic modeling, we don't do this enough as evaluators. It's really also having a conversation with the people who are designing that strategy and implementing it. Like, where is your sphere of influence and control, so that you can actually say, I can control this performance, and therefore my performance measures are this, right? These are things outside my control. So I can't say that my performance is because of this, but let's think about how we integrate that into the evaluation. I think this will take 3 years versus I think this will take 10 years. Like, we don't spend enough time trying to carve out the pieces that we can actually do, manage, control outside of a control, because there's all these other variables that impact it. And then having a real discussion that puts it all together in a way that makes sense. I think if we don't do that, when we don't do that, what ends up happening is that we have measures and outcomes that are completely unrealistic. And that's when things break down, because you didn't even have the ability to even make that change in the first place.
So true.
Yeah.
So true. So, yeah, I think I was just going to say, I think you nailed it. And I think it's why it's so important that folks do make that distinction of timeline and arc of the impact that they're hoping to have. And to your point, get real clear about those performance measures. I also, the only thing I would name is it's why qualitative measurement becomes so important. Because many of the things that we're actually hoping to have an impact on are a long arc. And so understanding whether people are moving, our understanding of people's perceptions of whether we're making progress becomes really important to whether or not we're moving in the right trajectory. And one of the few measures we can have about whether or not the immediate steps we're taking feel like they are leading us in that trajectory. So I do think, that's where the qualitative piece to me becomes absolutely critical.
Yeah. Yeah. And I also want to actually go point to something you said earlier on about the part about how much you know, the more you know, right, your ratings go down and everything. I was also going to say that when you use evaluation to evaluate that kind of change and then use it as a diagnostic tool, I think one of the challenges we have is that then evaluation becomes, as I think Melvin Hall, an evaluator, once said, right, it's like the evaluation becomes an intervention in of itself, because it's a diagnostic tool, right? And so it's a diagnostic that based on that, it begins to say like, no, we're not doing something right, we're doing something wrong. And then when that happens, and it's intentionally done that way, right? But when the evaluation is intentionally used that way, then we get into a whole big debate about like, well, are you actually now biased? Are you actually now rigorous? Is this evaluation rigorous? It's no longer objective. And then that opens a whole other can of worms about evaluation and what that means for doing evaluation in service of racial equity.
And are you trying to open that can of worms?
No, I'm not.
I mean, but I would say you've named it beautifully, which is because I think what you named is really important to state. Of course, evaluation is biased. That's the very reason why we're having this conversation. The idea that we enter into anything without bias is, in my mind, deeply problematic. And I will say that I think it's important to name it in the same way we're trying to name the ways that bias show up now. But for us, I do think that that sense of using evaluation as a diagnostic, as a proactive tool, is really important. And I'm glad that there's folks out who want to do independent evaluation and try to keep it as unbiased as possible. I mean it. But I also really do think it's essential that we understand the power of evaluation tools in actually helping to make change, to what you named. And that I think it's important that we're naming when we're doing what our intentions are, so it never feels manipulative.
Right.
But I think it's also really silly not to imagine that those tools can be used in a way that actually helps us make real change. And I'll give one example, which is we see it all the time. One of the real values of doing evaluation around racial equity in organizations is that people understanding that their peers are in agreement with them. That information is invaluable to making change occur, right? That when people are like, oh, 80% of people actually are in agreement with me that we need to be doing something differently, it actually results in them actually being more activated. So I think it's so important to understand that those tools can be so helpful and so necessary to the kinds of changes that we're all hoping for in the world.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
I do. And I love what you said that, because I will publicly say this now. That was a lesson you taught me when I was looking at the instrument you created. And that question was like, do you feel that do you believe in equity, or do you want racial equity? And I remember looking at that question going, well, who would say no? I mean, is this like, we want to cut down the survey questionnaire from 100 questions to 50. Why are we asking this question? Who would say no? And you told me what you just said. And I just remember the light bulb going on and be like, oh, that makes total sense. But that just shows us like my own implicit biases of like how you design a question in a survey questionnaire and just coming at it from that perspective and being like, oh, wait a minute, let's take a look at the purpose of this question. So yeah, thanks for
and I love
that.
I love that you made that. And maybe that's, that's a really, that's such a great point, is that, we've been talking about how you frame, how you think about evaluation. But at that question, it's the power question. What is the purpose of the question, right? Because at the end of the day, as evaluators, it's always going to come down to some kind of question, right? And what is the purpose? What's the goal? What's its intent? What will that information be used for? Is in some ways the power of the question itself. And so I do think, after going through all your process, going back and actually really thinking about those questions, what is their intent? What is the power in it? What's the purpose? I love that. I think that's right. I really do. At the end of the day, I think that's right.
Great. Well, thank you. We have only 1 minute, and I want to say a couple of things. So first of all, thank you, Glenn, for doing this. I really appreciate you coming
Thank you,
on today. Thanks, Wilan. I know you're kind of lurking in the background for supporting this. And I want to also actually give a shout out to Dante from our office. Dante from Community Science has been assisting us in the background with the technology of this. You don't see his face, but he plays a really important role in this. It's 3 o'clock. We're going to end on time. I want to say thank you, everybody, for participating. I hope you got something useful out of it, and I look forward to some of you hopefully next week. Thanks, Glenn, and have a wonderful day. And Wilan and Dante, thank you very much too.
Thank you. Thank you, Dante.